Aldrics Strong Spirit. Washington, D.C., 1923. Rose Kensington stood by her window, staring at the lamplight outside. Her shadow stretched along the floor. Then, she turned away. But her shadow didn't move. It lingered, frozen in place. And beside it, another silhouette appeared, Captain Thomas Sinclair's, standing at attention. Chapter 1. The Shadow That Didn't Leave. The gaslight hissed softly outside Rose Kensington's window, painting the cobblestone street below in a wavering, amber glow. It was a crisp October evening in 1923, 5 years since the armistice, 5 years since the world had supposedly exhaled. But Rose hadn't exhaled. Not really. She still felt the constriction in her chest, the ghost of a pressure that had settled there during those long, agonizing months of waiting, of praying, of fearing the worst. She stared at the lamplight, its reflection shimmering in the polished mahogany floor of her small, but meticulously kept, Washington, D.C. apartment. It was a comfortable life, a life many women her age 62 would envy. She had a modest pension from her late husband, Charles, a respectable, if somewhat dull, civil servant. She had her books, her needlepoint, her quiet routines. Yet, a profound emptiness gnawed at her, a hollow space where a vibrant heart used to beat. Her shadow stretched long and distorted across the floor, mimicking the elongated, distorted way she felt inside. It was a trick of the light, of course, but tonight it felt different. More substantial. More watchful. Rose shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the room was comfortably warm. The lingering heat of the day still clung to the brick walls, a reminder of the unusually warm autumn they were having. With a sigh, Rose turned away from the window, from the unsettling shadow. She needed to busy herself. Perhaps a cup of chamomile tea, a few pages of her latest novel, anything to distract her from the persistent feeling of unease that had settled over her like a shroud. But as she turned, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow, it hadn't moved. It remained stubbornly fixed to the floor, a dark, elongated silhouette against the polished wood. And then, Rose's heart stuttered, a painful flutter against her ribs. Beside her own shadow, another one had appeared. Taller, broader, undeniably masculine. A figure in a uniform, standing at rigid attention, the faint outline of a military cap casting a shadow within a shadow. Captain Thomas Sinclair. The image was impossible, a phantom conjured from the depths of her memory, from the years of grief and guilt that she had tried so desperately to bury. He stood there, as clear as he had been the last time she saw him, on that rain-soaked platform at Union Station, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and something else. Resignation? Foreboding? Rose blinked, convinced it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of the flickering gaslight. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the image to disappear. She had spent years trying to forget him, to convince herself that he was just a fleeting, wartime dream, a forbidden love that had bloomed in the poisoned soil of the Great War. She opened her eyes. He was still there. Not a sound escaped her lips, only a silent gasp that felt like it tore through her very soul. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the spectral form. The air around the shadow felt cold, unnaturally so, a chill that seeped into her bones and settled deep within her marrow. "Thomas?" she whispered, the name a fragile, broken sound in the quiet room. The shadow didn't respond, didn't move. It remained a silent, steadfast sentinel, a haunting reminder of a past she could never truly escape. Rose had met Thomas Sinclair in the spring of 1917, just weeks after America had declared war on Germany. She had been volunteering at a makeshift hospital in Washington, tending to the wounded soldiers who were beginning to trickle back from the front lines. She was a widow then, Charles having passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years prior. Her life had been a quiet, predictable affair, filled with social calls and charitable works. The war had changed everything. Thomas had been one of her patients, a captain in the American Expeditionary Forces, wounded in the shoulder during a brutal skirmish near the Marne. He was younger than her, by almost 15 years, a fact that had initially made her uncomfortable, self-conscious. But his eyes had held a depth of experience, a quiet intensity that had drawn her in from the moment she first saw him. He had been a writer before the war, a poet with a soul that saw beauty even in the midst of unimaginable horror. He had shown her his poems, scribbled on scraps of paper, stained with mud and blood. They were raw, visceral, heartbreakingly beautiful. They spoke of the futility of war, the fleeting nature of life, and the enduring power of love. Their connection had been immediate, undeniable. They had spent hours talking, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams. They had found solace in each other's company, a brief respite from the grim reality of the war. He had made her feel alive again, awakened a part of her that she thought had long been dormant. But their love was forbidden, a dangerous secret that they had guarded fiercely. He was a soldier, destined to return to the front lines. She was a respectable widow, bound by the constraints of society. And there was the war, a vast, insurmountable chasm that separated them, threatening to swallow them whole. Their last meeting had been a blur of tears, whispered promises, and desperate kisses. He had held her close, his hand trembling against her cheek. He had promised to return. He had promised to write. He had kept the second promise. The letters had arrived sporadically, censored and delayed, but each one a precious lifeline, a testament to their enduring love. He wrote of the horrors he witnessed, the constant fear, the gnawing loneliness. But he also wrote of her, of the memory of her smile, the warmth of her touch, the hope that she gave him. Then, the letters had stopped. The official telegram had arrived a few weeks later, informing her that Captain Thomas Sinclair had been killed in action during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The news had shattered her, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and despair. She had mourned him in secret, her heart breaking anew with each passing day. And now, 5 years later, his shadow stood in her living room, a silent, spectral accusation. Rose felt a wave of dizziness, a suffocating sense of panic. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Was she losing her mind? Was this the price she had to pay for her forbidden love, for her years of suppressed grief? The shadow remained, unwavering, a constant reminder of the man she had loved, the life she had lost, and the secrets she had buried deep within her heart. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, a testament to the enduring power of a love that even death could not extinguish. What did he want? Why was he here after all this time? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, unanswerable, as the shadow of Captain Thomas Sinclair held her captive in the quiet stillness of her Washington apartment. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of her composure. She had to know. She had to understand. Chapter 2. Ghosts of the Argonne Forest. The chill emanating from the shadow intensified, a palpable wave of cold that seemed to penetrate Rose's very bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shawl offering little comfort against the supernatural frost. The scent of damp earth and something metallic, faintly reminiscent of blood, filled the air, a ghostly echo of the battlefields Thomas had described in his letters. She forced herself to take a step closer, her legs trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, compelling curiosity. The shadow remained still, an unyielding silhouette against the warm glow of her living room. It was undeniably Thomas, the set of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head, the way he held himself with a quiet, almost weary dignity. Even in shadow, his presence was unmistakable.
"Why?"
Rose whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Why are you here, Thomas? What do you want?" The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of a passing car, the faint strains of music from a nearby gramophone. It was a stark contrast to the chilling stillness of the shadow, a reminder of the world that continued on, oblivious to the spectral drama unfolding in her small apartment. Rose closed her eyes, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. She had to confront this this haunting manifestation of her past. She had to understand why he had returned, what unfinished business had brought him back from the grave. She thought of the Argonne forest, the place where he had died. He had described it in vivid detail in his letters, a dense, tangled wilderness, a place of mud and blood, of constant shelling and the deafening roar of artillery. He had written of the fear, the bone-chilling cold, the ever-present stench of death. He had also written of the beauty he found there, the resilience of the human spirit, the camaraderie of the men he fought alongside. The Argonne, she murmured, the name a whisper of pain and remembrance. Is that it, Thomas? Is that where you are? As if in response, the shadow flickered, almost imperceptibly. A subtle shift in the darkness, a momentary blurring of the edges. Rose held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Was he trying to communicate? Was he trapped there, in that desolate, war-torn landscape? She remembered a passage from one of his last letters, a poignant description of the forest at dawn. He had written of the mist rising from the ground, shrouding the trees in an ethereal veil, of the faint light filtering through the branches, creating an almost otherworldly beauty. He had written of feeling a strange sense of peace there, a sense of connection to something larger than himself, something beyond the horrors of war. Are you at peace, Thomas? She asked, the question a desperate plea. The shadow remained silent, unmoving. But Rose felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle easing of the tension in the air. The chilling cold seemed to recede, replaced by a faint warmth, a gentle presence that felt familiar. She thought of his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the way he used to look at her, as if she were the only person in the world. She remembered the feel of his hand in hers, the warmth of his embrace, the whispered promises they had shared. A sudden image flashed through her mind, a vivid memory of a picnic they had shared in Rock Creek Park, a brief respite from the war, a stolen moment of happiness. They had spread a blanket beneath a towering oak tree, the sunlight dappling through the leaves. He had read to her from his favorite book of poetry, his voice a soothing balm to her anxious heart. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, she could almost see him, not as a shadow, but as he had been that day, his face alive with laughter, his eyes sparkling with love. The image was fleeting, a whisper of a memory, but it filled her with a profound sense of longing, a bittersweet ache for what had been lost. The shadow remained, but it seemed softer now, less menacing. The sharp edges had blurred, the rigid posture had relaxed. It was as if he were fading. Don't go, Rose whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Please don't leave me again. But even as she spoke the words, she knew it was inevitable. He was a ghost, a memory, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. He couldn't stay. The shadow began to dissipate, slowly, gradually, like smoke dispersing in the wind. The chill receded completely, the scent of earth and blood fading away. The room returned to its normal temperature, the only light now coming from the gas lamp outside, casting a warm, familiar glow. Rose stood there alone, in the silence of her apartment, her heart aching with a renewed sense of loss. The shadow was gone, but the questions remained. Why had he come? What had he wanted? Was he truly at peace? She looked at the spot where the shadow had stood, her eyes tracing the outline of his spectral form. A single tear rolled down her cheek, a tear not of fear, but of a profound, enduring sadness. She knew she would never truly forget him, that he would always be a part of her, a ghost in the chambers of her heart. But perhaps, just perhaps, his visit had brought her a measure of closure, a sense of peace that had eluded her for 5 long years. She sank heavily into her armchair, the worn fabric comforting against her skin. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, a gentle, reassuring sound. She needed to write it all down, every detail, before the memory faded. Before she forgot the feel of his shadow, the scent of the Argonne, the chilling whisper of his presence. She had to understand, or at least try. The night was far from over. Chapter 3. The Unsent Letter. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through the otherwise silent apartment. Rose sat at her small writing desk, a single lamp illuminating the page before her. Her hand trembled slightly as she uncapped her fountain pen, the nib scratching softly against the thick, creamy paper. She had pulled out her old writing box, a beautiful mahogany case that Charles had given her many years ago. It contained her stationery, her pens, her sealing wax, and a small, hidden compartment. Inside that compartment lay a stack of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They were the letters Thomas had sent her from France, the precious words that had sustained her through the long, agonizing months of the war. She hadn't looked at them in years, afraid of the pain they would evoke, the memories they would stir. But tonight, she felt compelled to reread them, to search for clues, for any hint of an explanation for his spectral visit. She carefully untied the ribbon and picked up the top letter, its edges softened and worn with time. The familiar handwriting, bold and yet elegant, sent a pang of longing through her heart. She traced the words with her fingertip, feeling the ghost of his touch in the ink. She began to read, immersing herself in his words, in the voice that had spoken to her so intimately across the miles and the years. He wrote of the mundane details of life in the trenches, the endless rain, the mud, the rats, the constant threat of shelling. He wrote of the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, the bonds forged in the crucible of war. He wrote of his longing for home, for peace, for her. Each letter was a testament to his courage, his resilience, his unwavering spirit. But beneath the surface, Rose could sense a growing weariness, a deepening sense of despair. The horrors he had witnessed, the constant exposure to death and destruction, had taken their toll. She reached the last letter he had sent, dated just weeks before his death. It was shorter than the others, the handwriting less steady, the words more guarded. He wrote of a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was about to happen, something terrible. He didn't elaborate, perhaps afraid of alarming her, or perhaps because he couldn't put his fears into words. He ended the letter with a plea. If anything should happen to me, Rose, know that I loved you. I loved you more than words can say. And I will always be with you, in spirit, if not in body. Rose closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. The words echoed in her mind, resonating with the chilling reality of his spectral visit. He had promised to be with her, in spirit. And he had kept his promise, in a way she could never have imagined. But there was something else in that last letter, something that she had missed before, something that now struck her with a sudden, jarring force. A small, almost imperceptible smudge of ink at the bottom of the page, just below his signature. She held the letter closer to the lamp, examining the smudge carefully. It wasn't a random mark, it was deliberate, a tiny, carefully drawn symbol. A circle with a line through it. Rose frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. She had seen that symbol before, somewhere. But where? She rummaged through the writing box, her fingers sifting through the old letters, the postcards, the scraps of paper. And then she found it. Tucked away in a small, hidden pocket of the box was a single, unsent letter. It was addressed to her, in Thomas's handwriting, but it had never been mailed. The envelope was sealed, the wax still intact. Her heart skipped a beat. An unsent letter? Why? What secrets did it contain? With trembling hands, she carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle and yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. She began to read, her eyes widening in disbelief. The letter was dated just days before his death. It spoke of a dangerous mission, a secret assignment that he had been ordered to undertake. He wrote of his growing suspicions, his belief that he was being betrayed, that someone within his own ranks was working for the enemy. He didn't name names, but he described a conspiracy, a web of deceit that reached high into the ranks of the military command. He wrote of coded messages, secret meetings, and a growing sense of dread. And then she saw it, the symbol, the circle with a line through it. It was the mark of a secret society, a clandestine organization that was working to undermine the Allied war effort. Thomas had stumbled upon their plot, and he was about to expose them. The letter ended abruptly, unfinished. He had obviously been interrupted, forced to stop writing before he could complete his message. Rose stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Thomas hadn't died in a random act of violence. He had been murdered. Murdered to silence him, to prevent him from revealing the truth. The shadow, the chilling cold, the scent of earth and blood. It all made sense now. He hadn't come to say goodbye. He had come for justice. He had come to reveal his killers. He had come to finish what was left undone. A wave of icy fury washed over her, replacing the grief with a burning desire for retribution. She had to find out who was responsible. She had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The unsent letter was a key, a starting point, and she wouldn't rest until she unlocked its secrets. The night was still young, and Rose Kensington was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman on a mission. Chapter 4. Whispers in the War Office. The sun rose, casting a pale, weak light through the curtains of Rose's apartment. She hadn't slept. The unsent letter had consumed her, its revelations fueling a restless energy that banished all thoughts of rest. She had reread it countless times, analyzing every word, every sentence, every subtle nuance. She had dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant black dress, a symbol of her mourning, but also a shield, a way to project an image of strength and composure. She needed to be taken seriously, to be seen as more than just a grieving widow. Her destination was the War Office, an imposing, granite building that housed the records and the personnel of the American military effort. It was a place she had avoided since receiving the telegram announcing Thomas's death, a place that held too many painful memories. But now, it was the only place where she might find answers. She arrived at the War Office just as the morning rush was beginning, the streets teeming with clerks, officers, and messengers, all hurrying to their respective duties. The air was thick with the scent of paper, ink, and stale coffee, a familiar aroma that brought back a wave of nostalgia, tinged with sadness. She approached the reception desk, her heart pounding against her ribs. A young, bespectacled clerk looked up at her, his expression polite but indifferent. "I need to speak to someone in the records department," Rose said, her voice steady and firm. "It's about Captain Thomas Sinclair of the 308th Infantry Regiment. He was killed in the Argonne in 1918. The clerk nodded, his fingers tapping on a typewriter. "Do you have a specific request, madam? A death certificate, perhaps?" "No," Rose said. "I need more than that. I need to see his complete file, everything you have on him. His service record, his medical reports, any correspondence related to his death." The clerk hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's highly unusual, madam. Those files are confidential, restricted to authorized personnel only." "I understand," Rose said, her voice unwavering. "But I have reason to believe that Captain Sinclair's death was not what it seemed. I believe he was murdered." The clerk's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He looked at her more closely, assessing her, trying to determine if she was serious or simply a delusional, grieving woman. "Murdered?" he repeated, his voice skeptical. "That's a very serious accusation, madam. Do you have any proof?" Rose reached into her handbag and pulled out the unsent letter, carefully folded and protected within a thin, leather folder. "This," she said, placing it on the desk. "This is a letter from Captain Sinclair, written just days before his death. It speaks of a conspiracy, a betrayal, a secret society working to undermine the war effort. He was about to expose them, and I believe he was killed to silence him." The clerk picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. He read it slowly, carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's also incomplete. There are no names, no specific details, no concrete evidence." "I know," Rose said. "That's why I need to see his file. There may be something there, something that connects to this letter, something that can help me identify his killers." The clerk hesitated again, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. He was clearly torn between his duty to uphold the rules and the potentially explosive nature of Rose's request. I don't know," he stammered. "I need to speak to my supervisor." This is above my pay grade. He disappeared into a back office, leaving Rose standing at the desk, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The minutes stretched on, feeling like an eternity. The sounds of the War Office swirled around her, the clatter of typewriters, the murmur of voices, the ringing of telephones, a cacophony of activity that only heightened her sense of isolation. Finally, the clerk returned, accompanied by a tall, stern-looking man in a dark suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, the head of the records department. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice formal and reserved. "I understand you have some concerns about Captain Sinclair's death." Rose nodded, her gaze meeting his directly. "I do," she said. "I believe he was murdered, and I believe the evidence is in his file." Mr. Harrison looked at the letter, then back at Rose. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing, probing. "This is a very serious matter, Mrs. Kensington," he said. "If your allegations are true, it could have significant implications. But I need to be cautious. I can't simply release confidential files based on a single, unsent letter." "I understand," Rose said. "But I'm not asking you to believe me blindly. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, to investigate, to find the truth." Mr. Harrison hesitated, his gaze flickering between Rose and the letter. He was clearly weighing the risks, the potential consequences of either granting or denying her request. Finally, he sighed, a subtle indication of his internal struggle. "Very well, Mrs. Kensington," he said. "I will allow you access to Captain Sinclair's file. But under strict supervision, of course. And you are not to remove anything or disclose any information to anyone outside this office. Do you understand?" Rose nodded, her heart filled with a surge of relief. "I understand," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Thank you." He led her to a small, windowless room, furnished with a single table and 2 chairs. He placed a thick, manila folder on the table, its contents labeled with Captain Sinclair's name and service number. "This is everything we have on him," Mr. Harrison said. "Take your time. But remember, you're being watched." He left the room, closing the door behind him. Rose sat down at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the file. The whispers of the War Office seemed to fade away, replaced by the silent whispers of the past, the echoes of a conspiracy that had cost Thomas Sinclair his life. And Rose Kensington was determined to hear them, to understand them, to bring them to light. The weight of the file felt heavy in her hands, the paper old and fragile. This was it, the beginning of the truth, or another dead end. She took a deep breath and began to read. Chapter 5. A Dance of Denial. The file was thick, a comprehensive record of Thomas Sinclair's military career, from his enlistment in 1917 to his death in 1918. Rose meticulously examined every document, every report, every piece of correspondence, searching for any clue, any connection to the unsent letter. His service record was exemplary. He had risen quickly through the ranks, earning commendations for bravery and leadership. His medical reports showed the extent of his injuries, the physical toll that the war had taken on him. There were letters from his superiors, praising his dedication and his unwavering commitment to duty. But there was nothing, at first, that seemed to relate to the conspiracy he had described in his letter. No mention of a secret society, no hint of betrayal, no indication that he was involved in anything other than his official duties. Rose felt a growing sense of frustration, a creeping doubt that she was chasing a phantom, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. Had she misinterpreted the letter? Had she read too much into his words? She was about to close the file, to admit defeat, when a small, almost insignificant detail caught her eye. A handwritten note, tucked away at the back of the file, attached to a report on the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The note was brief, and signed, and written in a hurried, almost illegible scrawl. It read, "Sinclair questioning orders. Suspect disloyalty. Observe closely." Rose's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the first concrete evidence that Thomas had been under suspicion, that someone had been watching him, questioning his loyalty. But who had written the note? And to whom? She examined the report to which the note was attached. It was a detailed account of the battle in which Thomas had been killed, written by his commanding officer, a colonel named Arthur Hamilton. Rose remembered Thomas mentioning Hamilton in his letters, describing him as a strict, by-the-book officer, a man who demanded absolute obedience and loyalty from his men. He had also written of a growing tension between them, a sense of unease, a feeling that Hamilton didn't trust him. Could Hamilton have been the one who wrote the note? Could he have been involved in the conspiracy? Rose felt a surge of anger, a burning desire to confront Hamilton, to demand answers. But she knew she had to be careful, to proceed cautiously. She couldn't simply accuse a high-ranking officer of murder without concrete proof. She decided to seek out Hamilton, to talk to him, to gauge his reaction, to see if she could uncover any further clues. She found his address in the War Office directory, a stately home in Georgetown, a wealthy neighborhood not far from her own apartment. She arrived at Hamilton's house in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The house was imposing, a testament to Hamilton's wealth and status. She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and determination. A stern-looking butler answered the door, his expression unwelcoming. "I'm here to see Colonel Hamilton," Rose said, her voice steady and firm. "My name is Rose Kensington. It's about Captain Thomas Sinclair." The butler hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The colonel is not receiving visitors," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "This is important," Rose insisted. "It's about Captain Sinclair's death. I believe the colonel may have information that could help me understand what happened." The butler remained unmoved. "I'm sorry, madam, but the colonel is not available." He was about to close the door when a voice called out from inside the house. "Let her in, Jenkins." A tall, imposing figure appeared in the hallway, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light. It was Colonel Hamilton, his face etched with the lines of age and experience, his eyes sharp and piercing. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I remember you. You were close to Captain Sinclair." Rose nodded, her gaze meeting his directly. "Yes," she said. "We were very close. And I believe he was murdered." Hamilton's expression didn't change. He remained calm, composed, almost indifferent. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Kensington," he said. "I assure you, Captain Sinclair died a hero's death, in the service of his country." "I don't believe that," Rose said, her voice unwavering. "I have a letter, written by Captain Sinclair, that suggests otherwise. It speaks of a conspiracy, a betrayal, a secret society." Hamilton raised an eyebrow, a subtle indication of surprise, or perhaps guilt. "A secret society?" he repeated, his voice skeptical. "That sounds like something out of a dime novel, Mrs. Kensington." "It's not," Rose insisted. "And I believe you know more about it than you're letting on." Hamilton smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. "You're mistaken, Mrs. Kensington," he said. "I have no idea what you're talking about." It was a dance of denial, a carefully choreographed exchange of words, each of them circling the truth, probing for weaknesses, searching for an opening. Rose knew she was walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could send her tumbling into the abyss. But she was determined to continue, to press him, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The colonel's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. She could sense it. The question was how to exploit it. She decided to play her trump card. Chapter 6. The Captain's Scars. Rose reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. She opened it and carefully removed a silver locket, its surface tarnished with age, a delicate chain dangling from its clasp. "Do you recognize this, Colonel?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Hamilton's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked by his stoic facade. He leaned in closer, his gaze fixed on the locket. "It appears to be a locket," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Many soldiers carried such trinkets. Reminders of home, of loved ones. "This was Thomas's locket," Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. "He always wore it. It contained a picture of me." She opened the locket, revealing a small, faded photograph of herself, taken years ago, during that brief, blissful spring of 1917. Her younger self smiled back at her, her eyes filled with a happiness that now felt like a distant dream. Hamilton stared at the photograph, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the locket, as if he were tempted to touch it, to hold it in his hand. But he stopped himself, his hand clenching into a fist. "I see," he said, his voice strained. "A touching memento. But I'm afraid I don't understand the significance." "This locket was found on Thomas's body," Rose said, her voice unwavering. "But it was damaged. There's a bullet hole right here." She pointed to a small, jagged hole in the back of the locket, a clear indication that it had been struck by a bullet. The silver was blackened and distorted around the hole, a testament to the force of the impact. Hamilton's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the damage. He said nothing, his silence more telling than any words. "The official report states that Thomas was killed by a German sniper," Rose continued. "But the angle of the bullet that struck this locket, it's inconsistent with that. It suggests that he was shot from close range. Perhaps even from behind." Hamilton finally broke his silence, his voice sharp and defensive. "Are you suggesting that one of his own men shot him, Mrs. Kensington? That's preposterous. Our soldiers were loyal, brave, dedicated. They would never betray a comrade." "Perhaps not all of them," Rose said, her gaze unwavering. "Perhaps there were some who were less than loyal. Some who were working for the enemy. Some who were part of a secret society." She saw a flicker of something in Hamilton's eyes, a fleeting moment of fear, of guilt, quickly masked by his carefully constructed facade. "I don't know what you're talking about," he repeated, his voice tight and controlled. "This is all speculation, conjecture. You have no proof." "I have this," Rose said, holding up the locket. "And I have Thomas's letter. And I have the note in his file, the one that suggests he was under suspicion of disloyalty. It all points to something, Colonel. Something you're not telling me." Hamilton stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He walked to the window, his back to Rose, his hands clasped behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the manicured lawn, his silence heavy and oppressive. Finally, he turned back to Rose, his face etched with a mixture of anger and resignation. "You're a persistent woman, Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I admire your tenacity, but you're digging into something that's best left buried. You're stirring up ghosts that should be allowed to rest." "Thomas is not resting," Rose said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He came to me, Colonel. His shadow, it appeared in my living room. He's not at peace. He wants justice." Hamilton stared at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of disbelief and something else. Could it be fear? "You're hallucinating," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grief can do strange things to the mind." "I'm not hallucinating," Rose insisted. "I saw him. And I know he was murdered. And I believe you know who did it." Hamilton sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to age him before her eyes. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his carefully composed facade crumbling, revealing the weary, haunted man beneath. "Very well, Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice resigned. "I'll tell you what I know. But I warn you, it's a dangerous story. And it may not be what you want to hear." He paused, looking at Rose, gauging her reaction, judging her resolve. He took a deep breath and continued, "There was a secret society. And Thomas, he stumbled upon it. The captain's scars weren't just physical. They were etched into his soul, his memory, his very being. And now Rose was about to uncover them all." The locket felt heavy in her hand, a tangible link to the past, to the truth. She gripped it tightly, steeling herself for what was to come. Chapter 7. The Secret in the Locket. Hamilton motioned for Rose to sit, and he himself sank into a worn leather armchair opposite her. The room was filled with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco, a comforting aroma that belied the dangerous secrets it held. "The society," Hamilton began, his voice low and hesitant, called themselves the Circle of Thorns. They were a group of influential men, both in America and in Europe, who believed that the war was a mistake, a needless waste of lives and resources. They wanted to end it, even if it meant collaborating with the enemy. Rose listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. This was what Thomas had hinted at in his letter, the conspiracy he had been about to expose. Their goals were complex, Hamilton continued. Some were driven by pacifism, a genuine belief that peace was worth any price. Others were motivated by greed, by the prospect of profiting from a negotiated settlement. And some were simply seduced by power, by the allure of being part of a secret, influential cabal. And Thomas, he discovered their existence? Rose asked. Hamilton nodded. He stumbled upon it quite by accident. He overheard a conversation, saw a coded message, recognized a symbol, the circle, with a line through it. He started investigating, quietly, discreetly. He was a brilliant man, Thomas. He had a keen mind, a sharp eye for detail. And he was about to expose them, Rose said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Yes, Hamilton confirmed. He had gathered enough evidence to implicate several high-ranking officers, even some government officials. He was planning to present his findings to me. He trusted me, you see. He believed I would help him bring the truth to light. Rose felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of her own suspicions about Hamilton. He had been Thomas's confidant, his ally, and she had accused him of being involved in his murder. But someone betrayed him, Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hamilton nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Someone within the circle of thorns learned of his investigation. They knew he was a threat. They had to silence him. And they used his own men to do it, Rose said, the realization hitting her with a sickening force. Yes, Hamilton confirmed. They arranged for him to be eliminated. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was made to look like an accident, a random act of war. But it was murder. Cold-blooded murder. Rose felt a wave of nausea, a suffocating sense of grief and rage. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Who? She whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Who was responsible? Who gave the order? Hamilton hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. He was clearly afraid, reluctant to reveal the names, to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. I don't know all the details, he stammered. I only know bits and pieces. I was never a member of the Circle of Thorns. I was an observer, a reluctant witness. But you know something, Rose insisted. You know who was involved. Tell me, Colonel. Please. Thomas deserves justice. Hamilton sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and respect. There was a man, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A powerful man. A man with connections everywhere. His name was Senator Alistair Blackwood. Rose gasped, her mind reeling. Senator Blackwood? He was a prominent figure in Washington society, a respected politician, a man known for his patriotism, his unwavering support for the war effort. Could he really be involved in such a treacherous conspiracy? It was too much to even fathom. Blackwood? She repeated, her voice incredulous. But he was a friend of my late husband. He attended our social gatherings. He seemed so honorable, so decent. Hamilton smiled sadly. Appearances can be deceiving, Mrs. Kensington, especially in Washington. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. But how can we prove it? Rose asked, her mind racing. Blackwood is untouchable. He has influence, connections, money. He can bury this, silence anyone who tries to expose him. Hamilton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Rose. This, he said, is a list of names. Members of the Circle of Thorns. It's not complete, but it's a start. It was given to me by Thomas. He entrusted it to me, just days before he died. He wanted me to use it to bring them to justice. But I was afraid. I didn't have the courage. Rose unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. The list contained several names, some familiar, some not. High-ranking military officers, government officials, wealthy businessmen. A web of deceit, stretching across the highest echelons of power. And at the top of the list, underlined in red ink, was the name, Senator Alistair Blackwood. "This is incredible," Rose whispered, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. "But it's still not enough. We need concrete proof. Something that directly links Blackwood to Thomas's murder." Hamilton hesitated, his gaze shifting to the locket that Rose still held in her hand. He reached out and gently took it from her, his fingers tracing the outline of the bullet hole. "There may be something else," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Something hidden within the locket itself." He examined the locket carefully, his fingers probing the edges, searching for a hidden compartment, a secret mechanism. And then he found it. With a delicate twist, he opened the back of the locket, revealing not just the photograph of Rose, but a small, hidden space behind it. And inside that space, nestled within a tiny, velvet lining, was a single, rolled-up piece of paper. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate proof. The missing piece. Chapter 8. Reign over Arlington. Hamilton carefully extracted the tiny, rolled-up paper from the locket's secret compartment. It was fragile, almost crumbling with age, the ink faded and blurred. He handed it to Rose, his hands trembling slightly. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what Thomas wanted you to find." Rose took the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. She unrolled it slowly, carefully, revealing a single, handwritten sentence. It was written in Thomas's familiar script, but the words were coded. "It's a cipher," Rose said, her brow furrowing in concentration. "He used a code to protect the information." "Yes," Hamilton confirmed. "He told me about it. He said it was a simple substitution cipher, based on a poem. A poem that you both knew." Rose's mind raced. A poem? Which poem? She and Thomas had shared many poems, exchanged verses, written lines to each other in their letters. But which one held the key to the cipher? She closed her eyes, trying to recall the words, the images, the emotions that had flowed between them during those stolen moments of intimacy. And then it came to her. "The Raven," she whispered, her eyes opening wide. "Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. He used to read it to me by candlelight in the hospital. He said it reminded him of the darkness of war, but also of the enduring power of love." Hamilton nodded. "That's it," he said. "He told me." He said the key was in the first stanza. Each letter of the alphabet corresponds to a word in the poem, in a specific order. Rose quickly recited the first stanza of The Raven in her mind, matching each letter to a word. It was a slow, painstaking process, but gradually, painstakingly, the coded message began to reveal itself. As the words emerged, a chilling picture began to form. The message was a detailed account of a meeting, a secret gathering of the Circle of Thorns, held just days before Thomas's death. It described the location, the attendees, and the purpose of the meeting, to plan Thomas's assassination. And at the end of the message, a single name, clearly identified as the one who gave the order, the one who orchestrated the murder, Senator Alistair Blackwood. Rose stared at the decoded message, her hands shaking, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and vindication. This was it. This was the concrete proof she needed. This was the evidence that would bring Blackwood to justice. "We have him," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We finally have him." Hamilton nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "Yes," he said. "But it won't be easy. Blackwood is a powerful man. He has friends in high places. He will fight this, with everything he has." "I know," Rose said, her voice firm and resolute. "But we have to try. We have to expose him. For Thomas. For all the others who have suffered because of his treachery." She looked at the decoded message again, her eyes tracing the words, the evidence that had been hidden for so long, waiting to be discovered. It was a testament to Thomas's courage, his determination, his unwavering belief in justice. The next day, Rose and Hamilton decided to meet at Arlington National Cemetery. They had previously agreed that this was the place. It was a fitting location, a place of remembrance, a place where the sacrifices of fallen soldiers were honored. It was also a place where Rose could feel close to Thomas, where she could draw strength from his memory, his spirit. A light rain was falling, a soft, melancholic drizzle that shrouded the cemetery in a misty veil. The white headstones stretched out in endless rows, a silent testament to the cost of war. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and damp grass, a familiar aroma that reminded Rose of Thomas's letters, of his descriptions of the Argonne forest. She found Hamilton standing near Thomas's grave, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked older, more frail, the weight of his guilt and his fear etched on his face. "Thank you for coming," Rose said, her voice soft and gentle. Hamilton looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I had to," he said. "I owed it to him, to Thomas, to you." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the rain falling softly around them, a gentle cleansing that seemed to wash away the years of grief and despair. "What do we do now?" Hamilton asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rose took a deep breath, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "We go to the authorities," she said. "We present the evidence. We expose Blackwood and the Circle of Thorns. We bring them to justice." Hamilton nodded, his gaze meeting hers directly. "I'm with you," he said. "I'll testify. I'll tell them everything I know. I'm no longer afraid." They walked together, side by side, towards the cemetery gates, two unlikely allies, united by a shared grief, a shared determination, a shared commitment to justice. The rain continued to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle, washing over Arlington, cleansing the ground, preparing the way for a new dawn, a dawn of truth, of reckoning, of healing. The path ahead would be difficult, dangerous, uncertain. But Rose Kensington was no longer alone. She had Hamilton by her side. And she had the spirit of Captain Thomas Sinclair guiding her, leading her, empowering her to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The locket, warm against her skin, was a constant reminder of his love, his courage, his unwavering belief in her. Chapter 9. The Spy's Confession. Rose and Hamilton decided their first step would be to contact someone they could trust within the government, someone with the authority and the integrity to investigate their claims. After much deliberation, they settled on Secretary of War, John W. Weeks. Weeks was known for his honesty and his unwavering commitment to justice, a man who would not be swayed by political pressure or influence. They arranged a meeting with Secretary Weeks at his office in the War Department, a secure location where they could present their evidence without fear of eavesdropping or interference. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, giving them time to prepare their case, to gather their documents, to steel themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. Rose spent the evening reviewing the evidence, organizing the documents, rehearsing her presentation. She wanted to be clear, concise, persuasive, to leave no doubt in Secretary Weeks' mind about the validity of their claims. She reread Thomas's unsent letter, the note in his file, the decoded message from the locket, each piece of evidence a testament to his courage, his determination, his unwavering belief in justice. She also gathered the list of names of the Circle of Thorns members, the evidence that Hamilton had provided, the key to exposing the full extent of the conspiracy. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement, of trepidation and anticipation. This was it. This was the moment she had been working towards, the moment when she would finally have the chance to bring Thomas's killers to justice. The next morning, Rose and Hamilton arrived at the War Department, their hearts pounding with a mixture of nerves and determination. They were ushered into Secretary Weeks' office, a spacious, well-appointed room, filled with the trappings of power and authority. Secretary Weeks greeted them warmly, his expression serious but welcoming. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern face and piercing eyes, a man who commanded respect and attention. "Mrs. Kensington, Colonel Hamilton," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I understand you have some urgent information to share with me." Rose nodded, her gaze meeting his directly. "Yes, Mr. Secretary," she said. "We have evidence of a conspiracy, a secret society operating within the military and the government, a society that was responsible for the murder of Captain Thomas Sinclair." Secretary Weeks' eyebrows shot up in surprise. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Rose, his expression intense and focused. Murder? He repeated, his voice incredulous. That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Kensington. Do you have proof? Rose stepped forward and placed the documents on his desk, carefully arranged in chronological order. Yes, Mr. Secretary, she said. We do. She began to present the evidence, starting with Thomas's unsent letter, explaining its contents, its implications. She then showed him the note in Thomas's file, the evidence of the suspicion and surveillance that had surrounded him. Finally, she presented the decoded message from the locket, the concrete proof of Senator Blackwood's involvement in Thomas's murder. She also shared the list of names of the Circle of Thorns members, the evidence that Hamilton had provided. Secretary Weeks listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious as he examined the documents, absorbed the information. He asked probing questions, challenging their assumptions, testing the validity of their claims. Rose and Hamilton answered his questions patiently, honestly, providing additional details, clarifying any doubts. They presented a united front, their voices calm and resolute, their determination unwavering. After what seemed like an eternity, Secretary Weeks leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the documents, his expression grave. This is extraordinary, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If this is true, it's a betrayal of the highest order, a conspiracy that reaches to the very heart of our government. It is true, Mr. Secretary, Rose said, her voice firm and unwavering. And we need your help to expose it, to bring the perpetrators to justice. Secretary Weeks nodded, his eyes filled with a steely determination. You have my word, Mrs. Kensington, Colonel Hamilton, he said. I will investigate this matter thoroughly, vigorously. I will leave no stone unturned. And if these allegations are proven true, I will ensure that those responsible are held accountable, no matter how powerful they may be. He paused, his gaze shifting to Hamilton. Colonel Hamilton, he said, I understand you have personal knowledge of this conspiracy. Are you willing to testify, to provide a sworn statement? Hamilton nodded, his voice clear and resolute. Yes, Mr. Secretary, he said. I am. I will tell you everything I know. I will cooperate fully with your investigation. Secretary Weeks smiled, a rare expression of approval that lit up his stern face. Good, he said. Then, let's begin. We have much work to do. As they left the secretary's office, Rose felt a surge of hope. For the first time since she encountered Thomas's shadow, she could see the path forward, the possibility that they would succeed. But then, a man stepped out of the shadows, a man who had obviously been listening at the door.
A spy.
And he was wearing a ring with the symbol of the Circle of Thorns. Chapter 10. A promise broken, a love rekindled. The man stepped out of the shadows, his face partially obscured by the dim light of the hallway. He was tall and slender, dressed in a dark suit that blended seamlessly with the surroundings. But Rose immediately recognized the glint of metal on his finger, the unmistakable signet ring bearing the symbol of the Circle of Thorns. Well, he said, his voice a smooth, menacing purr. What have we here? A grieving widow and a disgraced colonel, conspiring against their betters? Rose and Hamilton exchanged a quick glance, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. They were caught, exposed, their plans threatened before they had even begun.
Who are you?
Rose demanded, her voice trembling slightly, but holding a steely edge. The man smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. Let's just say I'm a friend of the senator's, he said. A loyal friend. And I don't take kindly to those who try to harm him. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Rose, his hand reaching inside his jacket, as if he were about to draw a weapon. Hamilton stepped in front of Rose, shielding her from the man's menacing advance. Stay back, he warned, his voice firm and resolute. Don't even think about it. The man chuckled, a low, throaty sound that echoed through the hallway. You're in no position to threaten me, Colonel, he said. You're a washed-up soldier, a man with nothing to lose. And I have friends in high places. He pulled out his hand, revealing not a weapon, but a small, silver whistle. He raised it to his lips, as if he were about to blow it, to summon reinforcements, to alert the authorities. "Don't do it," Rose pleaded, her voice desperate.
Please.
"This is about justice, about uncovering the truth. It's not about personal vendettas." The man hesitated, his finger hovering over the whistle, his eyes flickering between Rose and Hamilton. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the risks, deciding whether to escalate the situation or to retreat. "The truth?"
He scoffed.
"The truth is a dangerous thing, Mrs. Kensington. It can get people killed. And you're playing with fire." He lowered the whistle, a subtle indication of his decision. He had chosen not to alert the authorities, not yet. But he wasn't backing down either. "I'm going to give you one chance," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Walk away. Forget about this conspiracy. Forget about Thomas Sinclair. And maybe, just maybe, you'll live to see another day." Rose and Hamilton exchanged another glance, their eyes communicating a silent message of defiance, of determination, of unwavering commitment to their cause. "We're not walking away," Rose said, her voice firm and resolute. "We're not going to be intimidated by your threats. We're going to expose the truth, no matter the cost." The man sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to express a mixture of frustration and resignation. "Very well," he said. "You've made your choice. But don't say I didn't warn you. The Circle of Thorns has eyes and ears everywhere. You won't be safe. Not anywhere." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Rose and Hamilton standing alone in the hallway, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. They knew they were in grave danger, that their lives were on the line. But they also knew they couldn't back down, that they had to continue their fight for Thomas, for justice, for the future of their country. They had made progress with Secretary Weeks. That could not be undone. "We need to be careful," Hamilton said, his voice low and cautious. "We need to watch our backs. We can't trust anyone." "I know," Rose said. "But we can't let fear paralyze us. We have to keep moving forward. We have to expose Blackwood and the Circle of Thorns before they silence us forever." They left the War Department, their steps hurried, their eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of danger, any indication that they were being followed. They decided to return to Rose's apartment, a place where they felt relatively safe, a place where they could regroup, replan, and prepare for the next stage of their fight. As they walked, Rose felt a sudden wave of exhaustion, a physical and emotional toll of the day's events. She stumbled slightly, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. Hamilton reached out and caught her arm, steadying her, supporting her. "Are you all right, Rose?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Rose nodded, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fatigue and something else. A flicker of warmth, of gratitude, of connection. "I'm just tired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long day." "I know," Hamilton said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "But we're in this together. We'll get through this. I promise." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that surprised her, a warmth that seemed to melt the icy fear that had gripped her heart. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Rose felt a sudden, unexpected spark, a flicker of something that had been dormant for years, buried beneath the grief and the loss. It was a spark of attraction, of desire, of love. It was a forbidden love, a dangerous love, a love that could never be. He was a soldier, a man haunted by his past, a man who had betrayed his friend. She was a grieving widow, a woman bound by her memories, a woman who had loved and lost. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the connection between them, the shared grief, the shared determination, the shared hope for a better future. He released her arm, a subtle acknowledgement of the unspoken emotions that had passed between them. The promise he had made, the promise to protect her, to see this through, it was a promise broken in a way. Because he was falling in love with her. And that was dangerous. For both of them. The rain had stopped. The sun was beginning to peek through the clouds. But the storm was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Telegram from Paris. The tension hung heavy in the air as Rose and Hamilton entered her apartment. The encounter with the spy had shaken them, a stark reminder of the danger they faced. They double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and settled into an uneasy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Rose busied herself making tea, the familiar routine a small comfort in the midst of the turmoil. The clinking of china, the gentle hiss of the kettle, the fragrant aroma of chamomile, these small, ordinary details helped to ground her, to anchor her to the present moment. As she poured the tea, she couldn't help but replay the scene in the hallway, the man's menacing words, Hamilton's protective gesture, the unexpected spark of connection between them. It was a confusing jumble of emotions, a whirlwind of fear, attraction, and guilt. She handed Hamilton a cup, their fingers brushing briefly, sending a shiver down her spine. She quickly averted her gaze, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thank you," Hamilton said, his voice soft and gentle. He took a sip of tea, his eyes watching her over the rim of the cup. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a steady, rhythmic beat that marked the passage of time, the relentless march towards an uncertain future. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door, a sound that made both of them jump, their nerves frayed and on edge.
Who could that be?
Rose whispered, her voice filled with apprehension. "I don't know," Hamilton said, his hand instinctively moving towards his pocket, as if he were reaching for a weapon. "Stay here. I'll check." He cautiously approached the door, his body tense, his eyes narrowed. He peered through the peephole, his expression shifting from concern to surprise. It's a telegram," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and curiosity. He opened the door, revealing a young messenger boy, his uniform crisp and clean, his face eager and expectant. "Telegram for Mrs. Rose Kensington," the boy announced, holding out a small, sealed envelope. Rose took the telegram, her hands trembling slightly. Telegrams were always a source of anxiety, a reminder of the war, of the constant threat of bad news, of loss and heartbreak. She carefully tore open the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. She unfolded the thin, flimsy paper, her eyes scanning the brief, cryptic message. "Stop investigation. Come to Paris immediately. Matter of utmost urgency. Await further instructions. Hotel Regina."
Yes.
Rose stared at the telegram, her mind reeling. Paris? Why Paris? Who was A.S.? And what was the matter of utmost urgency? She looked at Hamilton, her eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of hope. It's from Paris," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says to stop the investigation. To go to Paris. Immediately." Hamilton took the telegram, his eyes scanning the message, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Yes," he muttered.
Who could that be?
"Someone connected to the Circle of Thorns? Someone trying to lure you away? To silence you?" "I don't know," Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. "But it also says, matter of utmost urgency. What if it's something important? Something related to Thomas?" Hamilton hesitated, his gaze shifting between Rose and the telegram. He was clearly torn, weighing the risks, the potential dangers, the possibility of a trap. "It's too risky," he said, his voice firm and decisive. "We can't trust it. It could be a trick. We need to stay here, to continue our investigation, to expose Blackwood." "But what if it's not a trick?" Rose insisted, her voice pleading. "What if it's a lead? A clue? Something that could help us find the truth?" She looked at the telegram again, her eyes focusing on the initials. A.S. And then it hit her. A sudden, unexpected realization, a flicker of recognition, a spark of hope. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Could it be Amelia Sinclair? Thomas's sister? Hamilton's eyes widened in surprise. "Amelia?" he repeated. "But she lives in Paris. She's a journalist. She works for a newspaper there." "Yes," Rose said, her voice growing stronger, more confident. "Thomas mentioned her in his letters. He said she was intelligent, resourceful, courageous. He trusted her. He said she was his closest confidant. But why would she send this telegram? Hamilton asked, his voice still filled with doubt. Why would she tell you to stop the investigation? To come to Paris? I don't know, Rose said. But I have a gut feeling that it's important. That she knows something. Something that could help us. She looked at Hamilton, her eyes pleading, her heart filled with a desperate hope. We have to go, Arthur, she said, using his first name for the first time, a subtle indication of the growing intimacy between them. We have to trust her. We have to find out what she knows. Hamilton hesitated, his gaze meeting hers directly. He saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering belief in her heart, the desperate need for answers. He sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to express a mixture of resignation and something else. A flicker of hope? A spark of love? All right, Rose, he said, his voice soft and gentle. We'll go. We'll go to Paris. Together. It was a reckless decision, a leap of faith, a gamble that could cost them everything. But it was also a chance, a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a possibility of finding the truth, of uncovering the secrets that had haunted them for so long. The telegram felt warm in her hand, a tangible link to the past, to Thomas, to his sister, to a potential ally in their dangerous quest. Chapter 12. Masks and Mirrors. The journey to Paris was a blur of hurried preparations, anxious anticipation, and unspoken fears. Rose and Hamilton secured passage on a transatlantic liner, a luxurious vessel that seemed a world away from the gritty realities of their investigation. The ocean voyage was long and tedious, but it gave them time to reflect, to strategize, to prepare for whatever awaited them in Paris. They spent hours discussing the telegram, analyzing its contents, speculating about Amelia Sinclair's motives, and weighing the potential risks and rewards of their decision. They also delved deeper into the evidence they had gathered, reviewing the unsent letter, the note in Thomas's file, the decoded message from the locket, and the list of names of the Circle of Thorns members. They knew they were walking into a dangerous game, a web of deceit and intrigue, where nothing was as it seemed, and everyone wore a mask, concealing their true intentions, their hidden agendas. As they drew closer to Paris, Rose felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger, a feeling that they were being watched, followed, manipulated. She shared her concerns with Hamilton, her voice low and cautious, her eyes scanning the other passengers, searching for any sign of suspicion, any indication that they were being targeted. I don't like this, Arthur, she whispered. I feel like we're walking into a trap. Hamilton nodded, his expression grave, his hand resting reassuringly on her arm. I know, Rose, he said, but we have to be careful. We have to be vigilant. We can't trust anyone. They arrived in Paris on a crisp, autumn morning, the city shrouded in a misty haze, the Eiffel Tower looming in the distance, a majestic symbol of a nation still recovering from the scars of war. They made their way to the Hotel Regina, a grand, opulent establishment, a haven for the wealthy and the influential, a place where secrets were whispered in hushed tones and conspiracies were hatched in dimly lit corners. They checked into their rooms, separate but adjacent, a subtle acknowledgement of the delicate balance between their growing intimacy and the need for discretion. Rose immediately sent a telegram to Amelia Sinclair, informing her of their arrival, requesting a meeting at her earliest convenience. She waited anxiously for a reply, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The hours passed slowly, the tension building with each tick of the clock. Rose paced restlessly in her room, her mind racing, her imagination conjuring up all sorts of scenarios, both hopeful and terrifying. Finally, late in the afternoon, a reply arrived. Amelia Sinclair would meet them that evening, in a small, discreet cafe near the Louvre, a place known for its anonymity, its privacy, its reputation as a haven for artists, writers, and spies. Rose and Hamilton prepared carefully for the meeting, choosing their attire strategically, concealing small, defensive weapons beneath their clothing, rehearsing their questions, anticipating potential threats. They arrived at the cafe early, securing a table in a secluded corner, their backs to the wall, their eyes scanning the entrance, watching every person who entered, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of danger. Finally, a woman approached their table, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, a long, dark coat concealing her figure. She was tall and slender, with an air of elegance and sophistication, a woman who commanded attention, respect, and perhaps fear. "Mrs. Kensington?" she asked, her voice low and melodic, with a slight French accent. Rose nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miss Sinclair?" she replied. The woman nodded, her eyes meeting Rose's directly, a flicker of recognition, of something else. Could it be sadness? Grief? "Please," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "Call me Amelia." They sat down, the tension palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions, hidden agendas, dangerous secrets. Amelia removed her hat, revealing a face that was both beautiful and haunting, her eyes reflecting a depth of experience, a weariness that mirrored Rose's own. She bore a striking resemblance to Thomas, the same high cheekbones, the same piercing gaze, the same quiet intensity. "I received your telegram," Amelia said, her voice steady and calm. "I understand you have information about my brother's death." Rose nodded, her gaze meeting Amelia's directly. "Yes," she said. "We do. We believe he was murdered. And we believe we know who was responsible." Amelia's expression didn't change. She remained composed, controlled, almost indifferent. "Murdered?" she repeated, her voice skeptical. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Kensington. Do you have proof?" It was a mirrored conversation, one that Rose had had before, many times. It was like looking into the past, into a reflection of herself. Rose realized that the room had gone still, the sounds of the cafe fading. It was just them, a perfect reflection, a trap. Chapter 13. The Weight of Silence. Rose felt a chill run down her spine, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Amelia's calm demeanor, her skeptical tone, her almost rehearsed response, it was all too familiar. Too similar to the conversations she'd had with Colonel Hamilton, with Secretary Weeks, even with the spy in the War Office hallway. "We do have proof," Rose said, her voice unwavering, despite the growing unease in her heart. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the now familiar documents, Thomas's unsent letter, the note from his file, the decoded message from the locket. Amelia's eyes flickered over the papers, but her expression remained unchanged. She didn't reach out to take them, didn't show any sign of surprise, or grief, or even curiosity. "These prove nothing," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Circumstantial evidence at best. Hearsay. Conjecture." Hamilton shifted in his seat, his hand instinctively moving towards the small pistol concealed beneath his jacket. "It's more than that, Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice low and firm. "We have a list of names, members of a secret society, the Circle of Thorns. Your brother was about to expose them. They silenced him." Amelia raised an eyebrow, a subtle gesture of amusement. "Mockery? The Circle of Thorns?" she repeated, her voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. "That sounds like something out of a penny dreadful, a childish fantasy." Rose felt a surge of anger, a burning frustration at Amelia's dismissive attitude, her apparent lack of concern for her own brother's death. "It's not a fantasy, Miss Sinclair," Rose said, her voice sharp and insistent. "It's real. And your brother was a victim of their treachery. He was murdered to protect their secrets." Amelia sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to express a mixture of boredom and impatience. "Mrs. Kensington," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. "I understand you're grieving. You're looking for answers, for someone to blame. But you're mistaken. My brother died a hero's death, in the service of his country. He was killed in battle, a casualty of war. It's tragic, but it's the truth." She stood up, abruptly, signaling the end of the conversation. "I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help," she said, her voice devoid of any genuine sympathy. "But I have other matters to attend to." She turned to leave, her long coat swirling around her, her figure disappearing into the crowd of the cafe. Rose and Hamilton stared after her, stunned, speechless, their minds reeling from the unexpected encounter. What just happened? Rose whispered, her voice filled with confusion and disbelief. She didn't believe us. She didn't even care. Hamilton shook his head, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a growing suspicion. Something's not right, Rose, he said. Something's off. She's hiding something. But what? Rose asked, her voice pleading. Why would she lie? Why would she protect Blackwood? Why would she betray her own brother? Hamilton stood up, his gaze fixed on the entrance of the cafe, his mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information, searching for a pattern, a clue, an explanation. I don't know, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. But I have a gut feeling that Amelia Sinclair is not who she seems to be, that she's playing a role, that she's part of the conspiracy. The weight of silence that had fallen over them during the meeting now seemed to press down on them, suffocating, oppressive. It was the silence of secrets, of lies, of betrayal. Rose felt a wave of despair, a sense of hopelessness. They had come to Paris seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking an ally. But they had found only more questions, more deception, more danger. What do we do now, Arthur? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hamilton looked at her, his eyes filled with a steely determination, a renewed sense of purpose. We don't give up, he said, his voice firm and resolute. We keep digging. We uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a surge of warmth through her, a reminder of the connection between them, the shared grief, the shared determination, the shared love. We'll start by investigating Amelia, he said. Her background, her connections, her activities. We'll find out what she's hiding. And we'll expose her, just like we'll expose Blackwood. The silence in the cafe was broken by the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the sounds of a city oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But for Rose and Hamilton, the silence lingered, a heavy, oppressive presence, a reminder of the betrayal they had just experienced, the danger that still surrounded them. The weight of that silence was a burden they would carry with them, a constant reminder of the stakes, the cost of their pursuit of justice. Chapter 14. Across the Potomac. Rose and Hamilton left the cafe, the Parisian night air cool and damp against their skin. The encounter with Amelia had left them shaken, their hopes dashed, their suspicions heightened. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the implications of Amelia's denial, her apparent complicity in the conspiracy. We need to find out more about her, Hamilton said, breaking the silence, his voice low and determined. Her background, her connections, her activities here in Paris. She's hiding something, Rose. I'm sure of it.
But how?
Rose asked, her voice filled with frustration. She's a journalist. She has contacts, resources. She could be anywhere doing anything. We're in a foreign city. We don't speak the language fluently. We don't know who to trust. We'll start with her newspaper, Hamilton said. Find out who she works with, what stories she's been covering, who her sources are. It might give us a lead, a clue to her true allegiances. They returned to their hotel, the opulence of the surroundings a stark contrast to the grim reality of their situation. They spent the evening researching Amelia Sinclair, using the hotel's limited resources, a telephone, a directory, a few outdated newspapers to try and piece together her life, her career, her connections. They discovered that she worked for a small, independent newspaper known for its investigative journalism, its willingness to challenge authority, its pro-German sympathies during the war. That's interesting, Hamilton said, his brow furrowing in concentration. Pro-German sympathies? During the war? That could explain a lot. But it doesn't make sense, Rose said, her voice troubled. Thomas trusted her. He said she was his closest confidant. Why would he confide in someone who sympathized with the enemy? Maybe he didn't know, Hamilton suggested. Maybe she hid it from him. Or maybe she changed. Maybe she was recruited by the Circle of Thorns. The more they learned about Amelia, the more confusing, the more contradictory her profile became. She was a brilliant journalist, a respected figure in Parisian society, a woman known for her intelligence, her independence, her compassion. But she was also a woman with secrets, with hidden connections, with a past that seemed to contradict her present. They decided to visit the newspaper's office the next morning, posing as researchers, hoping to glean some information about Amelia, to speak to her colleagues, to uncover any clues that might shed light on her true motives. The newspaper office was a small, cluttered space, filled with the clatter of typewriters, the smell of ink and paper, the buzz of activity. They were met with suspicion, their questions met with evasive answers, their presence clearly unwelcome. They managed to speak to a few of Amelia's colleagues, but they learned little of substance. Amelia was described as a talented, dedicated journalist, a woman who was passionate about her work, a woman who kept to herself, a woman who rarely spoke about her personal life. "She's a bit of an enigma," one of her colleagues said, shrugging his shoulders. "Brilliant, but secretive. We don't really know much about her." Frustrated by their lack of progress, Rose and Hamilton decided to take a different approach. They decided to follow Amelia, to track her movements, to observe her activities, to see if they could catch her in a lie, to uncover any evidence of her involvement in the conspiracy. It was a risky move, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, but they felt they had no other choice. They had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. They spent the next few days shadowing Amelia, following her from her apartment to her office, to cafes, to restaurants, to meetings, observing her interactions, noting her contacts, searching for any sign of suspicious behavior. They saw her meeting with various people, some known journalists, some unknown figures, men in dark suits, women with veiled faces, people who seemed to exude an air of secrecy, of power, of danger. One evening, they followed Amelia to a secluded villa on the outskirts of Paris, a grand, imposing building surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed men. "This is it," Hamilton whispered, his voice tense with excitement. "This is where she's meeting them. The Circle of Thorns." They watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows, as Amelia entered the villa, the heavy gates closing behind her, sealing her off from the outside world. They waited for hours, the night growing colder, the tension building, their anticipation turning to dread. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Amelia emerged from the villa, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Could it be regret? Remorse? She walked quickly, her head down, her coat pulled tightly around her, as if she were trying to disappear, to escape the watchful eyes of a night. Rose and Hamilton followed her, keeping a safe distance, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were about to uncover the truth, to expose the conspiracy, to bring Amelia Sinclair to justice. Or perhaps something else entirely. As Amelia walked, she made an unexpected turn. Away from her apartment. Toward the river. She paused near a bridge. She took something out of her purse. A small box, and in one motion, she threw it over the edge. Into the darkness. Into the water. She was getting rid of evidence. Or, at least, that is what Rose and Hamilton thought. They had to get that box. Back in America, they decided to take a trip. To cross the Potomac. To visit Senator Blackwood's residence. To find what Amelia had discarded, in their own way. Chapter 15. The Truth in the Trenches. Rose and Hamilton returned to Washington, the weight of their Paris discoveries heavy on their minds. Amelia's actions, her secretive meetings, the discarded box, it all pointed to her involvement in the conspiracy, but they still lacked the concrete proof they needed to expose her, to link her directly to Thomas's murder. They decided to shift their focus back to Senator Blackwood, to revisit the evidence they had gathered, to search for any overlooked clues, any hidden connections that might tie him to Amelia, to the Circle of Thorns, to Thomas's death. They knew that Blackwood was a powerful man, a master manipulator, a man who covered his tracks meticulously, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. But they were determined to find a way to break through his defenses, to expose his treachery, to bring him to justice. They decided to take a bold, risky step, to confront Blackwood directly, to accuse him of his crimes, to gauge his reaction, to see if they could provoke him into revealing something, anything, that would confirm their suspicions. They knew it was a dangerous game, a gamble that could backfire spectacularly, but they felt they had no other choice. They had exhausted all other avenues, explored every other lead, and they were running out of time. They arranged a meeting with Blackwood at his stately Georgetown home, the same house where Rose had first confronted Colonel Hamilton, the same house where she had first glimpsed the shadows of the past. They arrived at the appointed hour, their hearts pounding with a mixture of trepidation and determination. They were ushered into Blackwood's study, a grand, opulent room, filled with leather-bound books, antique furniture, and the unmistakable aura of power and privilege. Blackwood greeted them with a smooth, charming smile, his eyes betraying a hint of wariness, suspicion. He was a tall, imposing figure, with silver hair and a commanding presence, a man who exuded confidence, authority, and a subtle undercurrent of menace. "Mrs. Kensington, Colonel Hamilton," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Rose stepped forward, her gaze meeting his directly, her voice firm and unwavering. "We're here to talk about Thomas Sinclair, Senator," she said. "About his murder. And about your involvement in it." Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing, his expression turning to one of controlled anger. "Murder?" he repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Kensington. Do you have any proof? Or are you simply relying on the ramblings of a grieving widow and a disgraced colonel?" "We have proof," Senator Hamilton said, stepping forward, his voice equally firm. "We have Thomas's unsent letter, the note in his file, the decoded message from the locket. We have a list of names, members of the Circle of Thorns. And we have Amelia Sinclair." Blackwood's eyes flickered for a moment, a subtle betrayal of his carefully constructed facade. He had not expected them to know about Amelia, about her connection to the conspiracy. "Amelia Sinclair?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "What does she have to do with any of this?" "She's your accomplice, Senator," Rose said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "She's part of the Circle of Thorns. She helped you plan Thomas's murder. And she's been covering it up ever since." Blackwood laughed, a cold, mirthless laugh that echoed through the room. "You're delusional, Mrs. Kensington," he said. "Amelia Sinclair is a respected journalist, a woman of integrity. She would never be involved in anything like this." "She was in Paris," Hamilton said, his voice relentless. "We saw her. Meeting with your associates. At a villa. Outside the city." Blackwood's composure finally cracked, a flicker of fear, of desperation, crossing his face. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "You're lying," he said, his voice rising in anger. "You're making this up. You have no proof." "We have the truth, Senator," Rose said, her voice unwavering. "And the truth will come out. One way or another." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, tarnished object, a piece of shrapnel, jagged and sharp, embedded with bits of dirt and blood. "Do you recognize this, Senator?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Blackwood stared at the shrapnel, his eyes widening in horror, his face paling, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before their eyes. It's from the Argonne," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the battlefield." "Yes," Rose said, her voice filled with a deep, profound sadness. "It was found near Thomas's body. It's a piece of the shell that killed him. But it's not just any shrapnel, Senator. It's marked." She turned the shrapnel over, revealing a small, almost imperceptible inscription, etched into the metal, a circle with a line through it. The symbol of the Circle of Thorns. Blackwood gasped, his eyes fixed on the symbol, his body trembling, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. It can't be," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and despair. "It's a lie."
A fabrication.
"It's the truth, Senator," Rose said, her voice firm and resolute. "The truth that Thomas died trying to expose. The truth that you've been trying to hide." The truth that will finally bring you to justice. Blackwood sank back into his chair, defeated, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. He had been exposed, his secrets revealed, his power shattered. The truth, like the shrapnel from the Argonne, had pierced through his defenses, leaving him vulnerable, exposed and broken. The trenches of his past had finally caught up with him. The muddy fields of France, the blood-soaked earth, the screams of dying men, it had all come back to haunt him. And Rose Kensington, the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had dismissed as a grieving widow, had been the one to bring him down. It had all come full circle. Chapter 16. A flicker of hope. The silence in Blackwood's study was heavy, broken only by the senator's muffled sobs. Rose and Hamilton stood silently, watching him, their emotions a complex mixture of triumph, sorrow, and a lingering sense of unease. They had won. They had exposed Blackwood. They had uncovered the truth about Thomas's murder. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the years of grief, the web of deceit, the profound sense of loss that still clung to them. What happens now? Rose whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze fixed on Blackwood's slumped figure. Hamilton sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, the weight of their ordeal finally settling upon him. We go to the authorities, he said, his voice weary but resolute. We present the evidence, the shrapnel, Blackwood's confession, everything. They'll have to arrest him, charge him, bring him to trial. Rose nodded, her mind racing, trying to anticipate the next steps, the legal battles, the public scrutiny, the inevitable backlash from Blackwood's allies, from the Circle of Thorns. It won't be easy, she said, her voice filled with apprehension. He still has influence, connections. He'll fight this, with everything he has. I know, Hamilton said, his voice firm. But we have the truth on our side. And we have each other. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar surge of warmth through her, a reminder of the bond that had formed between them, the shared grief, the shared determination, the shared love. As they prepared to leave, Blackwood looked up, his face tear-stained, his eyes filled with a mixture of despair and something else. Could it be regret? Remorse? Wait, he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. There's something else. Something you need to know. Rose and Hamilton exchanged a quick glance, their hearts pounding with a renewed sense of anticipation, of dread. What else could there be? What other secrets remained hidden in the tangled web of the conspiracy? What is it, Senator? Rose asked, her voice cautious, her eyes fixed on his face. Blackwood hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously around the room, as if he were afraid of being overheard, of being watched. Amelia, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She's not who you think she is. She's not one of us. Rose and Hamilton stared at him, stunned, speechless, their minds reeling from this unexpected revelation. What do you mean? Hamilton asked, his voice sharp and insistent. She was in Paris. We saw her. Meeting with your associates. Blackwood shook his head, his eyes filled with a desperate plea.
It was a ruse, he said.
A performance. She was protecting someone.
Protecting Thomas.
Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart skipping a beat.
Thomas?
She repeated, her voice incredulous. But he never mentioned a child. He told me, he loved me. Only me. Blackwood sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He did love you, Mrs. Kensington, he said. But before the war, before he met you, he had a brief relationship with a French woman. A woman who bore him a child.
Asson.
And Amelia she knew? Rose asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Blackwood nodded. Yes, he said. She knew. She's been protecting the boy, raising him, keeping him safe from the Circle of Thorns. From me.
But why?
Hamilton asked, his voice filled with confusion. Why would she risk her life, her reputation, to protect a child of a man she supposedly betrayed? Blackwood looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. Because, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, she loved him. She loved Thomas. Just like you did. The revelation hit Rose with the force of a physical blow, a wave of emotions washing over her: shock, disbelief, confusion, and a flicker of hope. Thomas had a son. A living legacy, a part of him that still existed, a child she had never known, a child she now desperately wanted to meet. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Where is Thomas's son?" Blackwood hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously towards the window, as if he were afraid of being watched, of being overheard. "Paris," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's in Paris. With Amelia. She's protecting him, waiting for the right moment to bring him home." A flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness, ignited within Rose's heart. The journey was far from over. The fight was not yet won. But there was something to live for, something to fight for, something to hope for.
Thomas S.
A new chapter, a new beginning, a new possibility. The weight of the past still lingered, the shadows of grief and loss still haunted her. But now, there was a flicker of light, a glimmer of hope, a reason to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep loving. Chapter 17. The Price of Freedom. Rose and Hamilton left Blackwood's house, their minds reeling from the senator's confession. The revelation about Thomas's son, Amelia's true allegiance, and the ongoing threat of the Circle of Thorns had turned their world upside down, shifting the landscape of their mission, adding new layers of complexity and danger. They knew they couldn't go to the authorities just yet. Blackwood's confession, while significant, was still fragile, and the existence of Thomas's son added a vulnerable element that needed protection. They needed to secure the boy's safety before exposing the full extent of the conspiracy. "We have to go back to Paris," Rose said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. "We have to find Amelia, find Thomas's son, and bring them both to safety." Hamilton nodded, his expression resolute. "But we have to be even more careful now," he said. "The Circle of Thorns knows we're onto them. They'll be watching us, waiting for us. We can't trust anyone." They decided to travel separately, under assumed names, using different routes, to minimize the risk of being followed or intercepted. They agreed to meet in Paris at a pre-arranged location, a small, obscure hotel far from the opulence of the Regina, a place where they could blend in, disappear into the anonymity of the city. The journey back to Paris was fraught with tension, every encounter, every glance, every overheard conversation fueling their paranoia, their sense of being hunted, pursued. Rose found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, scanning the faces of strangers, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of danger. She felt a profound sense of vulnerability, a fear for her own safety, but also a fierce determination to protect Thomas's son, to ensure his future, to give him the life that his father had been denied. She arrived in Paris exhausted, her nerves frayed, her body aching from the long journey. She made her way to the agreed-upon hotel, a small, nondescript building in a quiet, residential neighborhood, far from the tourist crowds, far from the prying eyes of the Circle of Thorns. Hamilton arrived a few hours later, his face etched with weariness and concern. They embraced, a brief, desperate hug that conveyed the depth of their shared fear, their shared determination, their shared love. "Did you have any trouble?" Rose asked, her voice low and anxious. Hamilton shook his head. "No," he said. "But I felt it. The pressure. The sense of being watched. They know we're here, Rose. They know we're coming for them." They spent the next few days planning their next move, carefully researching Amelia's whereabouts, trying to track her movements, to find any clue to the location of Thomas's son. They revisited the newspaper office, posing as potential clients, subtly questioning her colleagues, trying to glean any information about her personal life, her contacts, her secrets. They learned that Amelia had been absent from work for several days, claiming illness, but her colleagues were skeptical, whispering rumors of a secret assignment, a dangerous mission, a hidden agenda. "She's on the run," Hamilton said, his voice grim. "She knows we're close. She's trying to protect the boy, to get him out of the country." They discovered that Amelia had a small apartment in a quiet, secluded neighborhood, far from the bustle of the city center. They decided to stake out the apartment, to watch for any sign of her, to follow her if she appeared, to find out where she was hiding Thomas's son. They spent hours watching the apartment, hidden in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the entrance, their bodies tense with anticipation, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Finally, one evening they saw her. Amelia emerged from the apartment, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She was carrying a small suitcase, and by her side, holding her hand tightly, was a young boy, about 5 years old, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, a striking resemblance to Thomas. Rose felt a surge of emotion, a wave of grief and joy, of loss and hope, washing over her. This was Thomas's son. This was the living legacy of the man she had loved, the man she had lost, the man she was still fighting for. Amelia and the boy walked quickly, their heads down, their pace hurried, as if they were trying to escape, to disappear into the anonymity of the Parisian night. Rose and Hamilton followed them, keeping a safe distance, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were about to confront Amelia, to demand answers, to secure the boy's safety, to bring an end to the long, dangerous journey that had begun with a shadow in a Washington apartment. The price of freedom, they were about to find out, was higher than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 18. Beyond the Shadows. Rose and Hamilton followed Amelia and the boy through the winding streets of Paris, the night air cool and damp, the city lights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mirror their own anxieties and uncertainties. They kept a careful distance, blending into the crowds, trying to remain unnoticed, their eyes fixed on Amelia and the boy, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They saw Amelia hail a taxi, her movements hurried, her face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. She and the boy climbed into the back seat, the taxi speeding off into the night, disappearing around a corner, leaving Rose and Hamilton scrambling to find another cab, to continue their pursuit. They followed the taxi through the darkened streets, the chase growing more intense, more dangerous, as they neared the outskirts of the city. They knew that Amelia was trying to escape, to get the boy out of the country, to protect him from the circle of thorns, from the forces that had killed his father. Finally, the taxi pulled up to a small, secluded airfield, a private airstrip used for charter flights, for discreet departures, for escapes. Rose and Hamilton watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows, as Amelia and the boy emerged from the taxi, their figures silhouetted against the dim lights of the airfield. They saw a small plane waiting on the tarmac, its engine idling, its propeller spinning slowly, a symbol of freedom, of escape, of a new beginning. They knew they had to act quickly, before Amelia and the boy boarded the plane, before they disappeared forever, before they were lost to them, to the justice they sought, to the legacy of Thomas Sinclair. "We have to stop them," Rose said, her voice firm and resolute, her hand reaching for Hamilton's arm, a gesture of support, of connection, of love. Hamilton nodded, his expression grim, his hand instinctively moving towards a small pistol concealed beneath his jacket. "But we have to be careful," he said. "We don't want to endanger the boy.
We have to take them by surprise."
They approached the airfield cautiously, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of guards, of security, of the circle of thorns. They saw 2 men standing near the plane, dressed in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows, their postures tense, their hands hovering near their waists, as if they were carrying weapons. "They're waiting for her," Hamilton whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're part of the conspiracy. They're here to help her escape. Or to silence her." Rose felt a surge of fear, a chilling premonition of danger, a sense that they were walking into a trap, a final confrontation, a showdown that would determine the fate of Thomas's son, the future of their mission, the outcome of their love. As they drew closer to the plane, Amelia saw them, her eyes widening in surprise, her face paling, her hand tightening around the boy's hand, as if she were trying to protect him, to shield him from the danger that approached. "Rose?" she said, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Could it be relief?
Hope.
Amelia, Rose said, her voice firm and unwavering. We know the truth. We know about Thomas's son. We know about the Circle of Thorns. We know about everything. Amelia's expression shifted, her fear replaced by a steely determination, her eyes locking with Rose's, a silent communication, a shared understanding, a bond. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice low and urgent. It's too dangerous. They'll kill you. They'll kill us all. We're not afraid, Amelia, Hamilton said, stepping forward, his voice equally firm. We're here to help you, to protect the boy, to bring them to justice. The two men near the plane stepped forward, their hands moving towards their weapons, their faces revealing a mixture of menace and desperation. Stay back, one of them said, his voice harsh and threatening. This is none of your business. Walk away. And maybe you'll live to see another day. It is our business, Rose said, her voice unwavering, her gaze fixed on the boy, on Thomas's son, her heart filled with a fierce determination to protect him, to give him the future he deserved. He's Thomas's son, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. And we're not going to let you take him. We're not going to let you harm him. We're going to protect him. No matter the cost. The standoff, tense and fraught with danger, seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the silence broken only by the whirring of the plane's engine, the distant sounds of the city, the beating of their hearts. They were beyond the shadows now, standing in the dim light of the airfield, ready to face whatever came next. The past, the present, and the future all converged in that single, defining moment. Chapter 19. The Unveiling. Before anyone could react, a shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. One of the men near the plane crumpled to the ground, his hand still clutching the gun he had been about to draw. But the shot hadn't come from Hamilton or from the other guard. It had come from Amelia. She stood, her arm outstretched, a small pistol clutched in her hand, smoke curling from the barrel, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, relief, and fierce determination. The remaining guard, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Amelia and the fallen man, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Hamilton seized the opportunity, rushing forward, tackling the guard to the ground, disarming him, pinning him down with a swift, practiced movement. Rose ran towards Amelia and the boy, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. She knelt beside the boy, her eyes meeting his, a wave of emotion washing over her. He was so much like Thomas, the same dark hair, the same piercing blue eyes, the same quiet intensity. Are you all right? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He looked at Amelia, then back at Rose, his expression searching, questioning.
Mama?
He said, his voice soft and hesitant, his French accent adding a layer of innocence to his words. Amelia knelt beside him, embracing him tightly, her face buried in his hair, her body shaking with sobs. It's all right, Sherry, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It's all right. You're safe now. You're safe. Rose looked at Amelia, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a lingering question. Why, Amelia? She asked, her voice soft and gentle. Why did you pretend? Why did you lie to us? Amelia looked up, her eyes meeting Rose's directly, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness, regret, and a profound sense of relief. I had to, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I had to protect him.
Thomas.
I had to protect you. I had to infiltrate the Circle of Thorns. To find out who killed Thomas. To bring them to justice. You were working with them? Hamilton asked, his voice filled with disbelief, his gaze shifting between Amelia and the two captured men. Amelia nodded. Yes, she said. I pretended to be one of them. I gained their trust. I learned their secrets. I waited for the right moment. To expose them. To avenge Thomas. But the telegram, Rose said, her voice filled with confusion. The message to stop the investigation to come to Paris, it was a trap, Amelia said, for them, not for you. I knew they were watching you, that I have to meet them, to talk, to prove where I am, that I'm loyal. I needed you to come to Paris, to witness,
To help me. To expose them.
and the box, Hamilton said, the one you threw into the river. Evidence, Amelia said. Recordings of their meetings, documents, names, everything. I needed to get rid of it. Before they found it. Before they silenced me. She added in a whisper. I was going to retrieve it later. Rose looked at Amelia, her eyes filled with a newfound understanding, a profound respect, a deep admiration. She had misjudged her, doubted her, suspected her. But Amelia had been playing a dangerous game, a double agent, risking her life to protect Thomas's son, to uncover the truth, to avenge the man she had loved. You're incredibly brave, Amelia, Rose said, her voice filled with awe. Amelia smiled, a sad, weary smile that seemed to reflect the weight of her ordeal, the burden of her secrets, the price of her freedom. I did what I had to do, she said, her voice soft and gentle. For Thomas. For his son.
For justice.
The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder, closer, a signal that the authorities were on their way, alerted by the gunshot, by the commotion, by the unveiling of the truth. The Circle of Thorns, their secrets exposed, their power shattered, their members captured or on the run, was finally brought to an end. Senator Blackwood, his confession corroborated by Amelia's testimony, by the evidence she had gathered, was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted of conspiracy and murder. The truth, like the light of dawn, had finally broken through the shadows, illuminating the darkness, revealing the secrets, bringing justice to those who had been wronged, healing the wounds of the past. The unveiling was complete. The masks had fallen, the mirrors had shattered, and the truth, raw and powerful, stood revealed in the harsh light of the Parisian morning. But there was one piece still missing. The content of the little box thrown in the Seine. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. A Shared Heart. The days following the confrontation at the airfield were a whirlwind of activity. Police interrogations, legal proceedings, media scrutiny. Rose, Hamilton, and Amelia were thrust into the center of a storm, their lives disrupted, their privacy invaded, their every move dissected and analyzed. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of closure, of resolution, of peace. The Circle of Thorns had been exposed, Blackwood had been brought to justice, and Thomas's son, Jean-Luc, was safe, protected, finally free from the shadows that had haunted his young life. Rose and Hamilton spent as much time as they could with Jean-Luc, getting to know him, bonding with him, discovering the remarkable young boy who carried within him the legacy of his father, the spirit of the man they had both loved. Jean-Luc was a bright, inquisitive child, with a mischievous grin and a gentle heart. He spoke mostly French, but he was eager to learn English, to connect with the American side of his heritage, to understand the life and the death of the father he had never known. Rose found herself drawn to Jean-Luc, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and joy, of loss and hope. She saw Thomas in him, in his eyes, in his smile, in his quiet intensity, and she felt a profound sense of connection, a maternal instinct she had never fully realized, a love that transcended time and circumstance. Hamilton, too, felt a strong bond with Jean-Luc, a paternal affection that surprised him, awakened a part of him that had been dormant for years, buried beneath the scars of war, the weight of his guilt, the loneliness of his past. Amelia watched them, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a lingering sadness. She had protected Jean-Luc, raised him, loved him as her own. But she knew that he needed more, that he deserved a family, a home, a future filled with love and opportunity. One evening, as the sun set over Paris, casting a golden glow over the city, Rose, Hamilton, and Amelia sat together in a small cafe, Jean-Luc playing quietly nearby, drawing pictures with crayons on a paper tablecloth. What will you do now, Amelia? Rose asked, her voice soft and gentle, her eyes filled with concern. Amelia sighed, her gaze shifting towards Jean-Luc, her expression filled with a mixture of love and resignation. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long living in the shadows, fighting this battle. I don't know who I am anymore. What I want." "You're a hero, Amelia," Hamilton said, his voice firm and resolute. "You risked your life to expose the truth, to protect Jean-Luc, to avenge Thomas. You deserve happiness."
Peace.
Amelia smiled, a sad, weary smile that seemed to reflect the weight of her ordeal, the burden of her secrets, the price of her freedom. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice soft and grateful. "But I don't know if I can ever truly be free. The past, it always follows you. The shadows, they never really disappear." Rose reached out and took Amelia's hand, her touch conveying a sense of understanding, of empathy, of shared grief. "We all have shadows, Amelia," she said, her voice gentle and reassuring. "But we also have light. We have hope. We have love. And that's what matters. That's what gives us strength.
To keep going.
To keep fighting. To keep living." Jean-Luc looked up from his drawing, his eyes meeting Rose's, his expression filled with a mixture of curiosity and trust. "Grandmère?" he said, his voice soft and hesitant, the French word for grandmother sounding unfamiliar, yet natural, on his lips. Rose's heart skipped a beat, a wave of emotion washing over her. She had never been called grandmother before, had never expected to hear that word, to experience that connection. She smiled, her eyes filling with tears, her heart overflowing with a love she had never known she possessed. "Yes, Jean-Luc," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm your grandmère." She reached out and embraced him, holding him close, feeling his small body against hers, a tangible link to the past, to Thomas, to the future, to a new dawn. Hamilton watched them, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness, admiration, and a profound sense of longing. He had found love, unexpectedly, in the midst of chaos and danger, in the heart of a woman who had shared his grief, his determination, his journey. He reached out and took Rose's hand, their fingers intertwining, their eyes meeting, a silent communication, a shared understanding, a promise. They decided to return to America together, Rose, Hamilton, Amelia, and Jean-Luc, to start a new life, to build a new family, to create a future filled with love, hope, and healing. The shadows of the past would always linger, the memories of loss and betrayal would never fully disappear. But they would face them together, united by their shared grief, their shared determination, their shared love. A new dawn was breaking, a new chapter was beginning, a new heart was being shared. And in the gentle light of that dawn, they found the strength to move forward, to embrace the future, to live, to love, to be free. The little box, recovered from the Seine by some workers a few days later, contained not only evidence against the Circle of Thorns, but also a letter from Thomas to Amelia, in which he expressed his love for Rose, the regret of his past mistakes, and the hope for a future he would never see. A future that, in a way, had finally arrived. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, slowly began to heal. Rose and Hamilton, with Amelia's blessing and Jean-Luc's joyful acceptance, married in a quiet ceremony in Washington, surrounded by a small circle of friends and family. They built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of domesticity, a life that had seemed impossible just a few short years before. Jean-Luc thrived in his new home, embracing his American heritage while cherishing his French roots. He grew into a bright, inquisitive young man, with Thomas's dark hair and piercing blue eyes, and Rose's gentle spirit and unwavering determination. He excelled in school, developed a passion for writing, and showed a remarkable talent for languages, a legacy of his bilingual upbringing. Amelia remained a close part of their lives, visiting often, sharing holidays and special occasions, a beloved aunt to Jean-Luc, a cherished friend to Rose and Hamilton. She eventually returned to journalism, using her skills and experience to expose injustice, to fight for the truth, to make the world a better place, a legacy of her brother's sacrifice, her own courage, her unwavering commitment to justice. Rose never forgot Thomas. His memory lived on in her heart, in Jean-Luc's face, in the quiet moments of reflection, in the enduring power of a love that had defied time and circumstance. But she also found a new love, a different love, a love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and danger, a love that had sustained her, healed her, given her a new reason to live, to hope, to dream. Hamilton, too, found peace. He had atoned for his past mistakes, his guilt replaced by a sense of purpose, his loneliness replaced by a loving family, his scars finally beginning to fade. He devoted his time to veterans' affairs, helping other soldiers who had returned from the war, struggling to adjust to civilian life, haunted by the memories of battle, the shadows of the past. They often visited Arlington National Cemetery, standing together before Thomas's grave, paying their respects, remembering his sacrifice, honoring his legacy. They would tell Jean-Luc stories about his father, about his bravery, his kindness, his love. One autumn day, as the leaves were turning golden and the air was crisp with the scent of wood smoke, Rose and Hamilton stood hand in hand before Thomas's grave, Jean-Luc standing between them, a young man now, on the cusp of adulthood. "He would be proud of you, Jean-Luc," Rose said, her voice filled with emotion, her eyes gazing at her grandson, her heart overflowing with love. Jean-Luc nodded, his expression serious, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding, a maturity beyond his years. "I know Grandmere," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "And I'm proud of him. Of all of you." He looked at Rose, then at Hamilton, his eyes filled with gratitude, with love, with a profound sense of belonging. The sun set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones, a silent testament to the sacrifices of those who had fought and died for their country. But amidst the shadows, there was light, there was hope, there was love. Rose, Hamilton, and Jean-Luc turned and walked away, their figures silhouetted against the golden sky, a family united by loss, by love, by a shared destiny. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined them. They had moved beyond the shadows, into the light, into a future filled with promise, with hope, with the enduring power of love. The war was over. The battles had been fought. The wounds, though still present, were healing. And a new generation was ready to face the world, armed with the lessons of the past, the strength of their ancestors, and the unwavering belief in a brighter tomorrow. The circle was complete. The end.